Hello and welcome to episode 156 of the Chills of What podcast. Pleasure to be joined by Namrata Poddar. Namrata writes fiction and nonfiction, serves as interviews editor for Kweli, and teaches literature and writing at UCLA. Go Bruins. Her work has appeared in several publications, including Poets and Writers, Literary Hub, Longreads, the Kenyon Review, and the Best Asian Short Stories. Her debut novel, Borderless, was a finalist for Feminist Press's Louise Meriwether Prize. Good morning. How are you?
Doing good, yeah. It's warmed up a little here. It's been an unusually cold winter here in Southern
Yeah, I
California
heard
as
some of that.
well.
I heard some of that wet stuff has been falling down in SoCal.
Yeah, we can always
The
use the
heck?
wet stuff. Yeah, but we're
That's
so spoiled
ridiculous.
here with the
I know,
beaches.
right?
So
I
nice.
know, I know. Same up here, and it's like, I know we need the rain so bad, but it's like, you know,
I
you,
know.
you hate it when it comes. Oh man. Well, now, the novel, which is so good, is gonna be the main, thrust of our conversation. Is it pronounced, because it's split into two, it's not borderless. Is it
Right.
pronounced the same way, or is it like border space less, border pause less?
I tend to pause a little bit because
Okay.
there is a tendency in people to kind of conflate that into one word. And I
Right.
certainly do not intend the title to be one word. So I'd say border less, like a
Okay.
little bit of an emphasis on that because for reasons I mentioned.
Awesome. Well, apropos of nothing, well, not apropos of nothing, apropos of a little bit, but I love the term that you may have coined. You may be the first to write it, monologue. So good.
Could be, yeah.
I mean, as opposed to monologue, there's a difference. There's a monologue and there's a monologue. That was really well done.
Thank you.
I think it was Dia's mom, Dia, the main character.
Yes.
I think so. I'd love to know again, it's an honor to have you here, and I would love to know about some of the beginnings. Mumbai, I know you were born there, but I'd love to know about language. What was the language you spoke growing up or language is? What was your relationship with the written word?
Hmm. So language, yeah, speaking of monologue, right?
Huh.
A little bit of a correction. I wasn't born in Mumbai. I
Oh,
was
okay.
born in Calcutta, but raised in Mumbai. And I'm a
Okay.
proud Mumbai girl for that.
You
Just,
are.
from the time I have memories of sort of being here. I have firstly of Mumbai and then secondly of United States.
Okay.
Language, I mean, India is linguistically the most diverse country I know.
Hmm.
Africa is the most diverse continent,
Hmm.
but in terms of language, and Mumbai within India is it's like New York City, it's kind of the
Right.
migrant hub of South Asia,
Hmm.
very, very diverse ethno-linguistically and culturally.
Hmm.
So I grew up surrounded by languages. Most Mumbaikars grew up multilingual, and I was no exception to that. So my education, like most in urban, middle class urban India, and that's a different reality than rural India.
Hmm.
Urban India language of education, often for middle class and up, is English. So English is certainly my language of education. I
Hmm.
call it my first language. I proudly claim it to be my first language. It's
Hmm.
not my native language.
I see.
I don't speak fluently my native language because I come from a community of migrants. We've
Hmm.
moved from place to place and we've adapted to the local language. So my parents didn't speak to me in our native language. They spoke in India's national language, which is Hindi and English, and Mumbai parents very much sort of Hindi and English, which we
Okay.
call Hinglish. So they spoke their version of Hinglish.
Hmm.
My siblings and I, my cousins and I, my sibling, one sibling, and I, people of our generation, we spoke our version of Hinglish, but English for sure. I spoke the regional language Marathi, but also with neighbors, they had their own languages where we were living. So we
Wow.
picked up languages from. So like back and forth between languages is so
Yeah.
much a part. not just of Indian languages, but also in English. The English that we grew up with, there were many inflections to that. The English of school was a very colonial English, very formal, very British.
Right.
And I love American English because it feels so different to me than British English in so many ways. So that was the school, the English of school, the English of people of my generation was very peculiar, very inflected by slang and multiple languages. With our parents, it was a different English. And I hope the book, I hope Borderless, the novel, has those different inflections of English within it, or at least characters speaking. So that's sort of the relationship with language. With the written word, well, I always loved writing, and I did always well in school with language and writing. But that's where it stopped in many ways. Because if you did well where I come from, and which is a very gritty, middle class Mumbai, which would be considered like poor for first world standards or North American standards. Written word, if you're good at it, I don't think you're encouraged to pursue a career in it. That was not even a concept. Language was big. My dad is a musician. My grandfather, my father, they're very much into poetry and certain play with language. But it's sort of part of the community. There was no direction for anywhere between the older generation or my generation that you can take it somewhere. So I didn't know until a long time, until now, when people ask me, okay, where did it begin? Like you're asking, what's your relationship with the written word? When I look back, okay, that was there, but no one was there to point it out. So it was there, languages you learn, but I had no intention of becoming a writer. I didn't even know one could pursue sort of a path in it. That happened only after I moved from Philadelphia, where I went to grad school, when I came to Los Angeles. That's when, and the closest you could get to your love of storytelling was literary criticism. It's the only path I knew. And then I came to Los Angeles because I had a job teaching literature. And that's when I thought, okay, maybe this could be like a career path, like storytelling outside of analyzing, deconstructing, and teaching students could be a path for me. So that's sort of a very long-winded answer to your question.
No, I appreciate that. There's a lot there, of course. So apartment or flat?
Flat, then apartment now.
Good answer. Good answer. Not that there's a right answer, but interesting. Okay. You were talking about like Kolkata, is that correct? Where you're from originally? But so like, they'll talk about like, for example, like Mexican regional music, like banda and that kind of thing. Like you'll be in Mexico City, which is, depending on the year, one of the biggest cities in the world, maybe the biggest, depending on the year, top 3, 4, whatever. But so many people are one generation removed from like the rural areas, right? Or 2 generations. So I wonder, like, like Dia in the book, who's the main character, her ancestry, I believe, is from Rajasthan.
That's right, in the Thar Desert.
Is that the same for do you have like rural, like 3 and 4 or 2 generations back? Like, I guess the whole, Mumbai being a huge place, like you said, versus like how much of your, I guess, your writing and your background is rural and informed by that.
It isn't. So my ancestors, even going further back, like my great grandparents, they come from the Thar Desert, but they come from cities in the Thar Desert, which were key ports of the Silk Road. So I have an urban ancestry that way, but also migrant, because when the Silk Road, the trade routes of the Silk Road, they changed with colonization and the invention of the ship, and they became coastal. Many of man's like grandparents, right? Many of the older generation in my community, they moved to different Indian cities. So we went from cities in the Thar Desert to cities in coastal India. So that's where, but you're right. I mean, speaking of the gap between the urban and rural, I certainly have an urban history, but I also I'm married to an Indian American who has roots in rural India. So it's very different.
Yeah.
It's a very different world.
Oh, wow. Oh, very interesting. So, Toni Morrison has a quote about something to the effect of if you haven't seen the book you want in the world, you write it. did you like, I guess, ideas of representation, like did you, having the colonial education, was it kind of like, this is just what we read, that's the way it is? Or were you always kind of questioning, like, where are the Indian voices, where are the indigenous voices? And then did you kind of like write the book you wanted out there in the world that was
I
missing?
did. To answer the last question, absolutely I did.
All right.
As immodest as it sounds.
Hey, no. Brag about yourself. All right.
um, Representation was important, and that sort of ties in with the first question that you're asking about colonial education.
Mm-hmm.
For sure, my generation in urban India had a very colonial education. So I remember still, like so many kids of my generation, right back in the day, we were reciting the daffodils at the age of 7 or 8, like. Having no idea what daffodils are. We've never seen the daffodils anywhere
Right.
around us.
Right.
And Shakespeare, I mean, it's hard to imagine a study of literature without reading Shakespeare. At the same time, I remember, how old was I? Maybe 9, 10, preteen, and being forced in many ways to recite, to thine own self be true. And I'm like, this is not my English. This English has nothing to do with the English that I hear around me. So there was always a divorce. And that's why I mentioned I did not aspire in many ways to be a writer, because I associated being a writer with the world of literature, which I loved. I was always attracted to. At the same time, with that attraction coexisted a divorce. Between the world on the page in many ways, which you're attracted to, because as human beings, we relate to so many things on the page, no matter the literature of whichever part of the world. At the same time, it was like, where is my language? This is not how my people speak. And at the same time, we're Anglophone. We are proudly Anglophone as well. We are multilingual, but we are also Anglophone.
Right. Yeah, that's so interesting. That's such a prompt for teachers, right? Like if what you're teaching has nothing to do with what your students experience, what are you doing?
And I think it's the reality at the same time, don't you think? Majority of our world also, because of the history of colonization.
Exactly. Who were some of those voices early on that whether they're Indian American, or anti-colonialism, or writing about it, colonialism with a critical lens? Who are some of those writers who really inspired you?
I think they were in both. They were in the colonial world and they were in the non-colonial world. So I have to say I came to literature via maybe a colonial world firstly.
Sure.
So, but at the same time, because I've always claimed English as my language. And when I read English literature, I felt such a divorce with the literature that we were taught in the school. The other colonial language that we had the option of learning was French, because India has also had a French colonial presence, except that it doesn't have that big a colonial history as the British colonial history.
Right.
So French is something I kept pursuing. And for me, it was easier maybe to enter that colonial world than the English colonial world, because it was less of an immediate relationship with it, of antagonism, if that makes sense.
Right.
And that's how, so I mean, language learning is something I've always learned. I'm a huge advocate. You're teaching Spanish as well. I'm a huge advocate of learning and teaching foreign languages because of what it does to your worldview. And I loved entering a foreign world, maybe through French and Francophone culture, because Francophone is huge. Africa is a big part of Francophone culture. So experiencing Africa and Francophone culture, but also France. So for grad school, I applied because I got a full scholarship to kind of read books and write about it. You wouldn't take it for 7 years.
Not bad. 7 years?
7 years, yeah.
Wow.
I mean, 5 years originally. Most PhD programs offer that.
Students.
But humanities students are notorious for not finishing their PhD.
Exactly, right.
In 5 years. So for 7 years, it was fully funded. And someone, coming from a background, like I said, in terms of class, that would be considered poor in the first world standards. It was a huge lottery for me to kind of win that and opportunity.
Right.
So I would say some of my earliest influences are also from the Francophone tradition, French-speaking tradition, and French writers. I love the older ones, Rabelais, who is the equivalent of Shakespeare at that time in the French-speaking world. But what I loved in him is what I saw in Mumbai, is a certain play with languages, a very irreverent play with French language. And he makes a lot of fun of academia as well, which I love. So he's definitely—
You love academia, or you love making fun of academia, or both?
Maybe both. Both. I love academia. I'm certainly a book nerd, but like so many other places, it's a problematic institution as well. Very much like our, political institutions with the big P. So he's for sure one. Marcel Proust. I love Proust. Deeply meditative, philosophical kind of a writer, philosophical novel. Louise in the Renaissance. Again, the feminist writers I've always loved. So in the French tradition would be Louise Labbé. And then Christine de Pizan is one of the, in the Middle Ages, but she wrote an extremely feminist book for her time, The City of Ladies. So these are some of the ones in sort of the colonial tradition, one could say, or from the colonial language, coming from the colonial language. In the Anglophone, we've always had a strong tradition in the South Asian ones, and who have done storytelling in ways to challenge, right? Like Western modes of storytelling, but also the influence of British Empire on our culture. So Salman Rushdie, for sure, he's also a Bombay boy, and the way he did language in his writing. That was sort of my first brush. I was like, okay, I can enter the world of literature, because that was the first time I saw literature with a big L kind of reflect my world, but also English in that book, Midnight's Children. The way he did English in the book, that reflected my English. So I felt like that was the first book really that bridged that divorce I always felt with literature in some ways. Rushdie is great, but I think so. Suketu Mehta, who's a Pulitzer finalist, who lives in New York, once again from Mumbai. And of course, our women writers, we've had a long tradition, Arundhati Roy, Bharati Mukherjee, the earlier ones. These are two of my biggest ones. I love Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni, who teaches at University of Houston, because of the ways in which she's reimagined female or women characters from Hindu mythology, from our mythological traditions. African writers, great. Again, so many, both in the Anglophone tradition, Francophone tradition. Some of my biggest influences in Borderless, but also in my thinking, because I've written so much nonfiction, that challenge, right, some of the mainstream modes of storytelling that we teach in our workshops in the West. From Africa, but also from the Caribbean. And one of my biggest influences, I love Aimé Césaire. He's an Afro-Caribbean poet, one of the earlier ones, who one of the key thinkers also in terms of decolonization. I think he's part of that intellectual circle that led eventually, I feel, to the decolonization of Asian and African countries. And then the biggest influence, one of the biggest influence outside of South Asian traditions and American, USA and Anglophone traditions of USA, is Afro-Caribbean poet, and he was Nobel nominated the same year that Derek Walcott won the Nobel Prize, and his name is Edouard Glissant, who wrote in French. And like his writings about multiculturalism and how do we live with each other in harmony, all that is like so relevant to our times. I'm amazed how few, and he is a Caribbean, he's a French Caribbean writer, but from Caribbean, so he's also North American writer in that respect. Always amazed how little he's known in the United States. He's very well known outside of the United States, I feel, but less so. And his work is so relevant, I feel, to our country and all the questions that we talk about every 4 years during elections.
I'm thinking a lot with like the World Cup and like Morocco beat the whole Iberian Peninsula,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And all the colonizers and such. And I think a lot of Frantz Fanon.
Yes, of course.
Did
Yeah.
he write in French originally?
Yes, he
He
did.
did. Okay.
Yeah. And he's
Right.
part of the same kind of, yeah, the writers, yeah, big influence. Fanon is part of the same legacy, maybe in so many ways, as Aimé Césaire and Edouard
Okay.
Glissant from the Caribbean. Caribbean has such an amazing legacy, and
Right.
maybe Francophone Caribbean, also Hispanophone. You teach Spanish, so you
Yeah.
probably know this better than I do. But so much of it is relevant to a country, and I'm always surprised that we
Right.
don't, in our classrooms,
Hmm.
look outside of the Anglophone, right? English speaking traditions.
I
Yeah.
think that's changing, but way too slowly. Yeah.
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 I'm looking over my computer here at I have a Frantz Fanon poster. It's got the one of his famous quotes, but I think so much like with Trumpism and things like that. I think so much of cognitive dissonance that he spoke so much about, right? This idea that like if you have something in your head that you believe is believed to be true or can't have it not be true, you will do anything, you will say anything to justify it, to rationalize it, right? I'm not saying it as poetically as
Yeah.
he did, but that's
Yeah.
that's definitely always on my mind.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, and he comes from. I mean, he was trained as a psychiatrist. Like he has a whole psychology background, so that makes sense. I didn't know about this quote, but that would make sense. Yeah, coming from Fano.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh man. As we get into, more recent years, who are some contemporary writers? I mean, you've mentioned a couple, and some, they never go out of style, but who are some contemporary writers who are really challenging you, inspiring you?
Yeah, you mean in fiction or in
All
non?
all all around.
Yeah,
I mean,
I
who
was.
who you like excited about? Like, oh, there's this new article, she's got a new short story, or she's got a new book.
Gosh, so many.
Yeah.
I think it's an exciting time in American literature for
It is.
sure.
It is.
The scene is becoming more and more diverse. It needs to be a lot more, but I'll
Mm,
take the changes than none at all. So many peers are doing amazing work in poetry, but also reimagining places like the desert, because I have desert roots where
mhm.
I've never lived.
Right, right, right.
Is Natalie Diaz's poetry. I love Natalie Diaz's
Oh yeah.
work. I loved post-colonial love poem.
Mm,
In terms of play with language, because in fiction, that's what I'm drawn to. I've
mhm.
always been a narrative writer, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, less poetry. So I said already Salman Rushdie because of how he does things with language. I loved Sandra Cisneros's work, in
Mm.
especially her earlier work, The House on Mango Street,
Oh yeah.
with what it did with form, like questions of form, Woman Hollering Creek as well, what it did with
Yeah.
form, short fiction, but novels sometimes, like House on Mango Street, right? It's a novel in vignettes. It's a very interesting kind of a border zone form.
Hmm.
But what she did in her work with language, I love. Um, Nonfiction. I'm thinking fiction. There's so many. Gosh,
No, I'll put you on the spot. I know there's you could go on for hours, but
nonfiction. I also want to share Melissa Fabos's work when it comes to
oh okay.
deeply personal storytelling. I
Mm.
love Imani Perry. I
Oh
love
yeah.
her work because it's deeply personal storytelling, but she's also an academic, so she kind of
Right.
brings that kind of a little bit of an academic style in her writing, but weaves it in a way
Sure.
that makes it much more accessible to sort of a
Yes.
very
Yes.
large audience. And I love that skill. These are some, there are just so many.
No, I
um,
gotcha. And obviously we're wishing the best for Salman Rushdie with his recovery. I mean, that was
yes,
you just
yes,
saw the outpouring from the whole community, all the writing communities that he's beloved. Yeah, I don't want to be a literary hipster, but like you mentioned, Women Hollering Creek. I don't want to be like House on Mango Street was good, but and I love that. But yeah, Woman Hollering Creek. There's the one about the girl who gets pregnant through the guy. I want to say Chak, Chaq. He takes an indigenous name, and she's really into him because he's supposedly so much into indigeneity, and he basically just uses her like so many have. I'm not describing it perfectly, but that's one that always sticks with me. And that's from Woman Hollering Creek, and I think it's more of a straightforward story, but I think 11 is from that.
Or 7, you mean?
Is it? It's an age. I want to say 11. So where the girl loses her, there's a sweater loss in the classroom.
7.
It is 7?
7.
Okay. Yeah. So it's like her birthday, and there's just so much there. That's one that's nice to teach in the class. It's
Yeah.
deceptively simple, right?
Right. But deceptively simple. Yeah. Someone with the training, Cisneros first trained as a poet. So that as well, I appreciate the border crossing that happens, right? When she writes fiction, there are parts that are very poetic. You can sense sort of a background in poetry. But I think border crossing with form, I love a lot what she does with form and language. A lot of like oral storytelling that she kind of brings in a lot of, voices and things like that.
No doubt about it. So borderless, again, is 2 words. It's not borderless. It's not meaning without borders, or is it? I mean, is that kind of up to the reader, or do you have some ideas on what borderless means?
I certainly have ideas.
I guess the question is, do you want to share them or not? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. The reason to make it 2 words was because I didn't want people to get that impression, borderless meaning without borders. And yes, it's a meditation in many ways on what it might take for many of the women characters in the book to feel borderless when you're so kind of constrained by the system, right? And what is the system? The system is patriarchy, the system is capitalism, the system is a combination of 2, heteronormativity, et cetera, et cetera. That is certainly a meditation or an aspiration for many of the characters, that single word. But I didn't want it to be a single word because, I mean, as we are moving forward in time and with so many right-wing governments across the world, including in the country that I was born in, India, right now, our prime minister as well. I didn't want people to think, oh, we are in this borderless world where we have these right-wing governments enforcing more and more strictly borders and border control. So in that sense, I wanted to be very cautious of not using that term as one word. 2 words, borderless, because maybe at the everyday level, and this is what interests me the most, maybe in writing, is power dynamics and power struggles and how characters in different situations, they negotiate power. And they, especially those, the underdog, right? Those in the minority position within that situation, like how do they navigate the borders that can be imposed on them by different systems of power. So that's certainly one interpretation. But I would say, and I'm totally giving it away, is with the last chapter. In the book, there is the goddess of Hindu creation, Shakti, who's speaking in the last chapter. And I think if one had to take only one interpretation of the novel, I would say I would associate that with the last chapter, and Shakti at moments very directly talking to the Western literary establishment, and in many ways telling the establishment to border less the novel as a form.